Have you ever taken a look at one of your older ideas and just wanted to give it another shot? So I've been working on the commercial PDF for Swiftguard, my TTRPG that's based off of some of the scaffolding from SRD 5.2.1. And in the game mastering section, something I'm including are the 7 baby steps for masterful game mastering, which was also the topic of my very first video on this channel. So I went back and watched that first video to see if it still held up, and you can tell it was my first video on this channel, and it lacked some of the context of how I came up with that progression. So today, I want to revisit the 7 baby steps, review what each of them are, as well as some context for why I came up with them. Hi, I'm John, this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we're revisiting the 7 baby steps for masterful game mastering. Let's get into it. So, to start with some context, a few years into my journey of being a paid professional game master at a family education center, I suddenly had 3 or 4 friends that all wanted to try game mastering. So, I was a player in most of their first games, and for new GMs, all of them did really well. So it came as a surprise to all of us when, in the second or third session, everything seemed to collapse. Players that were enthusiastic about supporting these new GMs suddenly couldn't attend sessions for one reason or another. Or, even if they ran a killer first session, the pace screeched to a halt in the second or third, which just kind of killed the momentum for everyone wanting to continue that story. So as I was listening to these GMs' frustrations, and talking to the manager of that center, one of the things she asked me was, if you had to break down 7 baby steps for new GMs to follow in order to get good really fast, similar to Dave Ramsey's 7 baby steps to financial freedom, what would those 7 steps be? As we played with the progression, one of the things I also realized was those 7 baby steps weren't just for new GMs, they were also really helpful for seasoned GMs that were either starting a new group or introducing a new player to their table. And that's really where the title of Masterful Game Mastering came from. When I first floated that title, a lot of my friends said that it sounded really clunky or silly. But first of all, I thought because it was silly, it was a little memorable. And it really hammers home my love for the term game master. In all sorts of different TTRPG systems, the title of that role can change. In Draw Steel, it's called a director. I've seen it called the narrator or the judge or the referee. But the reason I like the term game master isn't because that person is the ultimate authority over their table and should be listened to, but more that that person is assuming a leadership role in service to their players. And part of that commitment is learning to master the aspects of the game. It's kind of like a self-mastery sort of thing. And there are ways to masterfully game master a game. We can all probably think of examples of this, famous ones being like Brennan Lee Mulligan, who was recently on an episode of TED, or Matthew Mercer. Individuals who are so good at their craft, we can't help but identify them as masters. So with my experience with game mastering and seeing some of these newer game masters develop their skill set, these 7 baby steps, in my opinion, are the cleanest progression from moving from being a brand new GM to one of the greats. So just to review what the 7 steps are, we have running a one-shot, running a story arc, running a campaign, growing a world, cultivating a particular table culture, tuning the system, and eventually mentoring. So let's dive in. Baby step 1 is to run a one-shot. The common thread I was noticing with all these new GMs that were frustrated by their games prematurely fizzling is that all of them wanted to go too big too fast. The story that they wanted to tell, whether it was because they had a custom world they wanted to explore, or they had a great dramatic idea for a villain, they immediately jumped to formatting their game as an ongoing campaign. And especially if you're a new GM and your players know that, they may not want to sign up for a potentially years-long storyline with the same characters. On top of that, for the most part, I've found that players often don't match the reality with what they say they want. So what I mean by that is when a new GM is like, oh, I want to throw together a new campaign, I want to try GMing. A lot of players will want to be on board and participate. But by the second or third session, life gets in the way. You know, you either have a dance recital to go to or a work event you can't get out of. And by being absent from an ongoing story, eventually players lose their commitment, the story loses momentum, and then just kind of stops. So instead, running a one-shot sets a GM up in a few different ways. First, they can feel like they ran a successful story by telling a beginning, middle, and end within a single session. Second, they really get a good sense of tempo. So a lot of GMs will go in thinking that they have to be all these NPCs or have all these descriptive details, when really a lot of the times players just like playing. And so one of the things you're learning is to actually sit back a little and let the players role play. You're really learning when to step in to start to move the story events along, but you also don't want to interrupt your players if they're enjoying just socially interacting with an NPC. The other thing with running a one-shot is, for whatever reason, if you do mess up as a GM, you can kind of isolate that one story and kind of ignore it for future games that you want to run. If you run a few one-shots in a row, it also helps you gauge how well your players can actually show up. I mean, if your players are able to attend 3 or 4 sessions in a row, that's a really good sign that they'll be able to handle a longer storyline. But if you're at session 3 and you started with 6 players and suddenly you're down to 2, well, now you can start to schedule a little more sporadically for when everyone's available, rather than going all in on a storyline that's doomed to fizzle. I also find that one-shots are great tests for a group's internal chemistry. I've always found it amazing how the inclusion or absence of a single player can completely change the dynamics at a table. So if, say, a friend wants to bring their spouse to the game, even if you like them personally, you don't really know who they are in a role-playing sense. So by running your games as one-shots first, it just helps you see how into it they are, and then have some honest conversations about what an ideal roster would look like for a more committed ongoing campaign. Now, in between running a one-shot and running a campaign, we have running a story arc. Now, different individuals are going to use or think of these terms differently. To me, a story arc is just a multi-session story that usually has a set number of sessions. So, for example, when I run Lost Mine of Phandelver, I can usually fit 1 chapter a session. So, if I'm going to run that adventure module, I can pretty safely say that it'll be completed within 4, maybe 5 sessions. There are stories that just really can't be told within a single one-shot. They need a little bit of room to breathe. But structurally, the longer the same storyline goes on, the more fragile it also becomes. So with a story arc, now you're testing if your players are able to commit to 3, 4, maybe even 5 sessions, exploring the same characters in the same story. You can even play with storytelling techniques like foreshadowing or cliffhangers, and you can see how your players' earlier decisions have consequences down the line, whether they be good or bad. Running a campaign, that's the ongoing thing that may take months or years of real-world time. I really find the difference between a story arc and a campaign, for me personally, being if the characters, level up. So, of course, this is specific to some TTRPGs and not others, but if I were to run a story arc, let's say the players bring level 3 characters to the table, usually I'll keep them at the same level, which I understand is in contradiction to what I said about Lost Mine, but a campaign is now going to follow the same characters over a span of different levels. And that's not to say a campaign can't have a predicted number of sessions too. There have been times I've run a storyline and I'm like, I think it'll take 10 or 20 sessions. But the idea with a campaign is just that you're taking the same structures of one-shots and story arcs, and you're expanding it out to give the characters room to develop over a longer period of time. I also personally like to think of campaigns just as nested one-shots and story arcs that string together with a common narrative theme. Which also brings me to the point that even if you want to run a campaign, nothing says you can't just start as one-shots and story arcs that build over time. Going back to Lost Mine, my very first completed campaign, I started with Lost Mine of Phandelver. The characters moved from levels 1 to 5. After level 5, everyone still wanted to play as the same characters, so I just moved them right into Tyranny of Dragons, which we then played for about the next year and a half. It started as a confined story arc, but expanded out into a larger world because the players were enthusiastic about continuing to explore their same characters. Which I guess is a good enough segue to baby step 4. I call it grow your world because a lot of GMs get into GMing because they like the idea of world building. A problem I've seen with a lot of GMs, though, is they fall so much in love with their world that that's what they make the game about. They forget that the whole point of the game is the player character's story, with the world just adding some context to the plot. I definitely recognize this as a problem when the GM is spending more time describing their world than they are letting the characters play. Or if they're setting up certain guardrails to prevent the players from ruining an aspect of their world that's not on their own terms. The reason I call it grow your world is as a reminder to GMs that, yes, you as the GM, the world builder, probably have this very detailed setting in mind. Even if you share it in like a 100-page setting Bible, that's not really a good way for your players to learn it. They're going to learn it best when you build the world in the player's mind through gameplay. So kind of like a garden, you have to grow everything, and then it's up to the players to appreciate what you created. World building doesn't stop at session 1, where you've created the world and now it's up to the players to learn it. As a GM, I found that the best worlds that I've been a player in are the ones where the GM creates storylines and scenarios that emphasize parts of the world, its history, and its conflicts for the players to directly participate in. Because again, the reason that you're world building is in service to your players, which kind of segues me to baby step 5, cultivating a particular culture. To me, this one actually might be the most important step of them all. But the reason it's so far down the line is because really in order to do this, you need to do a lot of self-work and self-reflection. I've found that just as having a strong world can elevate a story arc or a campaign, when your table just clicks and everyone has agreed upon values, that's where the game really becomes excellent. I think this is one of the qualities people can sense from Critical Role just by watching them. I don't think Critical Role would be as successful if the cast weren't real life friends as well. And yeah, they sometimes come up with arguments or conflicts, but one of the most revealing behind the scenes kind of conversations that I listened to once was Matt Mercer just talking about the fact that there will be sometimes the friend group will have conflicts. So one of the things they really work on is how to recover from them gracefully. And none of them really seem like just grognard dungeon crawlers. The cast of Critical Role, they're all theater kids. They want a theater kid type of game. And I'm not saying your game has to or should look like that. You may want quote unquote beer and pretzels D&D. You may want to play something more metagaming, where you're constantly looking to the camera like John Krasinski. Or maybe you're just playing yourself in a fantasy world. All that's totally fine. It's just when the group is clear and in agreement, that game suddenly becomes a lot stronger. An example I can think of is one of these new GMs I'm referencing, after having a few false starts with some games they wanted to run, decided to run a one-shot themed in Candyland. He literally came over and brought a Candyland board, and all of the players made candy-themed characters. Mine was Randy, the Thane of Candy. Another player created a rogue named Candevious, who was up to mischief. One of them was literally just named Candy Wizard. And we just went across the board, so if we got stuck in one of the zones of Candyland, there would be a combat encounter there. There was some interesting mechanics. It wasn't particularly deep combat or role-playing, but it was incredibly enjoyable. And we all had a great time because the mindset we went in to get out of this game was all in agreement. The most important part about cultivating a culture is that you, as the leader of your table, as the game master, need to model and reflect the values you want to see. So if you want a game that's more about political intrigue and social interaction, you can't constantly interrupt social interaction with combat. If you want a game that's a little bit more strategic, where the players are thinking through tactics, you can't make your monsters invulnerable to all of their strategies. The game mechanics will reflect the kind of culture you want cultivated at your table. Which does segue me into baby step 6. Tune the system is where you homebrew and alter things in order to get the most out of the game. Now, some people may gasp seeing homebrew almost at the very bottom of the list. I'm not saying you shouldn't ever homebrew before this. It's more that I've personally found that the best homebrew was implemented in agreement with a table's culture rather than just the GM's values. So, for example, when I started my latest campaign, one of the tenets I wanted is I wanted there to be strategic combat. Not necessarily super crunchy tactical combat, but more I wanted my players to think through their strategies and not just roll attack rolls and be like, I got a 17, did that hit? So one of the rules I decided to implement was facing from the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. In short, the way that it works is creatures have blind spots, and if you can attack from that angle, you have advantage because that creature is blinded. So now all of a sudden, instead of just rolling to attack, player characters were now trying to position themselves and distract opponents so that they'd be forced to turn, so that way maybe a rogue or a fighter could run up into their blind spot and hit them with advantage. There are other times I know GMs have done the opposite. They want combat to be a little quicker and a little less crunchy, so instead of a map and minis, they go theater of the mind. None of it is wrong as long as everyone's in agreement to the values at the table, which of course is going to make the game more fun. And baby step 7, that one is mentoring, which is kind of where I found myself when all these GMs suddenly wanted to start. You either have new GMs that want to try being leaders themselves, or you have players that just want to deepen their relationship with the game. Mentoring is this huge wide topic I can't possibly get into in one video, but the idea is that you may now have to lead by stepping back and supporting your friends, rather than you being the boss of everything. So those are the 7 baby steps to masterful game mastering. Now I want to hear what you have to say. Do you like this progression? Do you think I got any of these baby steps wrong? Is there one you particularly identify with? Let me know in the comments down below. Above that comment box is a little description box. In that description are links to the playtest materials for my TTRPG Swiftguard, which will release soon commercially on itch.io. If you see that playtest material and you want to give me feedback, again, you can leave it in the comments of a YouTube video, or you can go to the Swiftguard Discord and chat me up there. Other than that, have an awesome day, everybody, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.